The Madh-Habs schools of Ahlu-S-Sunnah. In reality, Ahlu-S-Sunnah is the vast majority of Muslims. They stuck to the same belief since the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and never deviated from it. Ahlu-S-Sunnah follow the four famous madhhabs in obedience to Allah and His Messenger without disputing the validity of any of them, despite the differences amongst them. It is important to know that in the past there were other valid schools, like the schools of Al-Awzaʿiyy, Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, the two Sufyans, as well as others. But these four are the remaining schools. The followers of these schools took great care to document their schools and pass them down to the following generations. The largest of those four schools is the Hanafiyy School, the followers of the great Persian Imam Abu Hanifah. Imam Malik was a contemporary of his and the greatest scholar in the city of Al-Madinah at the time. His school, the Malikiyy School, is the most widely spread in Africa, with the exception of the Eastern African countries. Imam Ash-Shafiǐyy, the scholar of Quraysh, was the greatest student of Imam Malik, and his school, the Shafiʿiyy School, is the most common in the areas of Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Jordan, as well as Indonesia and Malaysia. But many Syrians are Hanafis. As for the Hambaliyy School, the followers of Imam Ahmad Ibn Hambal, it is the smallest of the four. And that is because many of the people who likened Allah Ta'ala to the creations attributed themselves to this school and defamed it, repelling the people from adhering to it. In fact, in some of the works of the scholars, they refer to the Mushabbihah, the likeners, those who liken Allah to the creation, as Al-Hanabilah, the Hambaliys. This is only due to those people defaming the Hambaliyy school. And it is exactly like the people referring to the Wahhabis as the Salafis. Here we will take an opportunity to substantiate the validity of the schools, because this is one of the deviances of the Wahhabis. They say that following the schools, the madhhabs, is an innovation. Some of them, out of their ignorance, say, did the Prophet ﷺ follow a school? The answer to that silly question is, no, he did not follow a school. The schools are based on following him. This means that the schools use the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ as evidence. Therefore, Ahlu-S-Sunnah believes that if someone follows any one of those madhhabs, he would be guided. By that, they respect the acceptable differences within the boundaries of the Islamic law, as validated by the Prophet ﷺ himself, and just as the companions and their students respected the different judgments given by different mujtahid companions. Clear evidence from the incidents that took place between the companions at the time of the Prophet ﷺ is what was narrated by Al-Bukhari from the route of Ibn Umar, that he said, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لنا لما رجع من الأحزاب لا يصلين أحد العصر إلا في بني قريظة فأدرك بعضهم العصر في الطريق فقال بعضهم لا نصلي حتى نأتيها وقال بعضهم بل نصلي لم يرد منا ذلك فذكر للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فلم يعنف واحدا منهم. Ibn Umar said, when he returned from the battle against the united parties, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said to us, no one prays al-Asr until reaching Bani Qurayظah. And Bani Qurayظah were a tribe of Jews who had breached the treaty that they had with the Prophet. So he continues to say, some of them were en route when the Asr prayer came in. So some said, "We do not pray until we get there." And some others said, "No, we shall pray. That is not what he wanted from us." That was later mentioned to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he did not scold any one of them. The evidence contained in this hadith is that some mujtahid companions understood the apparent expression of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and thus took it to be permission to pray Asr outside of its time if it meant praying it only at their destination. Others understood that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was telling them to rush to their destination, so to pray the prayer in its time there, but not to pray the prayer outside of its time. Had their difference been unacceptable, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have scolded those who disobeyed him, because the belief of the Muslims is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam does not remain silent in the face of sins. This is exactly the difference between the schools. Some understood a hadith this way, while others understood it that way. Some referred to a hadith, while others did not confirm its authenticity, etc. But most importantly, all of those mujtahids were qualified. Thus, Ahlu-S-Sunnah, unlike the Wahhabis, they follow the companions in what they did in reference to imitation, taqleed of the scholars and following the schools. And as a result, they did not tamper with the rules of the religion. And more will be mentioned about the validity of following the schools in the section about the Wahhabi grandfather, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah. All of Ahlu-S-Sunnah have the same basic belief. They belong to one of two madhhabs, schools, of aqidah, belief, even if some do so without realization. And knowing about this is important. In brief, the two madhhabs of aqidah do not have different creeds. They do not have different beliefs. They carry the same basic belief. The difference between them is in such matters as definitions and terminology. In other words, the base of these two schools is the same. The outcome they reached in regards to the belief is the same. Their differences are in issues like defining terms. If someone follows one of the schools of aqidah, the Ashari school or the Maturidi school, he follows the belief of the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions, just as the one who follows the method of the previously mentioned schools of fiqh follows the method of the Prophet of Allah and his companions. If someone says, if their belief is the same, why have two different schools? And if they have two different schools, how could they both be the guided faction? The answers for these two questions are as follows. The first is that they are different schools because they were established by two different men in two different areas, but both with the same basic belief. And naturally, being different individuals, they would differ in their terminology and expressions, even if their belief were the same. Then the scholars who came after them applied the method of those two scholars and taught according to their ways, out of confession that those two scholars were the masters of their time in the science of Tawheed, in the science of creed, just as Al-Bukhari and Muslim were the masters in hadith narration, and the four imams were the masters of fiqh. If someone asks, do Al-Bukhari and Muslim have a school in hadith? The answer is yes. Amongst the scholars who followed the way of those two imams is Al-Hakim, the author of Al-Mustadrak. Thus, anyone who took by the way of Al-Ash'ari in expressing the matters of the creed was attributed to his school. Likewise is said about whoever taught and authored according to the way of Al-Maturidi. Furthermore, it is valid to say that whoever is an Ash'ari is a Maturidi, and whoever is a Maturidi is an Ash'ari. The answer to the second question is that the fact that they share the same basic creed, the same basic belief, confirms that both groups are the guided faction. Just as the companions of the Prophet, who had the same basic creed, differed about whether the Prophet ﷺ saw Allah. Some, like Ibn Abbas, said that he saw Allah with his heart, meaning he saw Allah with his heart instead of with his eyes. Others, like Lady Aisha radiyallahu anha, said he did not see Allah. Some of Ahlu-S-Sunnah said that he saw Allah with his eyes. Yes, what is correct is that he saw Allah with his heart and not with his eyes, and that it is possible that what Lady Aisha meant was that the Prophet did not see Allah with his eyes, and that no one will see Allah with their eyes in this lifetime, the proof for which does not befit these summarized lessons. But the point is that this difference does not mean that the companions have divided into factions. They all still have the same basic belief, which is that Allah can be seen. Likewise, the differing expressions between the Ash'aris and the Maturidis do not make them two different factions, because their basic creed is the same. Hence, what is precise is to say that they are two schools within the same guided faction. In explaining the Muslim's creed, most scholars, like the Shafi'i and the Malikiyy scholars, are Ash'aris, also known as Al-Asha'irah. Others, usually the Hanafi scholars, are Maturidis, and it should be known that they are not few in number. The Wahhabis hate both groups, claiming that the Ash'aris and the Maturidis are deviants. They are cornered into this claim because both fountains of knowledge refute the Wahhabi creed and all other deviant creeds. Furthermore, since they claim that the Ash'aris are deviant, and since most of the scholars are Ash'aris, they often quote scholars whom they would consider deviant. The clout of heavyweight scholars like An-Nawawi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, Al-Bayhaqi, and others give their books and lessons an authentic tone, although in reality such scholars refuted and disagreed with the Wahhabi beliefs. The Wahhabis pick and choose what they like from the scholars' comments and judgments. Then, if one were to show them what these scholars believed in, the Wahhabis would say, "Oh, but he's an Ash'ari." Ahlu-S-Sunnah is moderate and safe between the different extremes that are and have been practiced. Unlike the Wahhabis, they do not liken the attributes of Allah to the attributes of the creation, nor do they deny the attributes or existence of Allah as the Wahhabis would accuse them. They do not deem the intellect as something that has priority over the rules of Allah, nor do they stoop, like the Wahhabis, and read the Quran and the Hadiths without using their minds. Some scholars said that the one who reads the revelation without using his mind is like the one who steps into the light with his eyes closed, and the one who uses his mind without using the revelation is like the one who steps into the darkness with his eyes opened. We must step into the light with our eyes opened. We must accept the revelation of Allah and use our minds according to the guidance of the great scholars of Islam. What other than ignoring the mind allows a person to believe that the Creator has one side with two right hands, one foot, and one shin? A'udhu billah. This is what the Wahhabis believe. The one who is intelligent would be sure that the references that they took literally, that lead them to establish this deformed description, must have a different meaning. We ask Allah Ta'ala to keep us guided on the path of Ahlu-S-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and Allah Ta'ala knows best.